The turbulence hit Oceanic Flight 447 like a sledgehammer at 37,000 feet. Sarah Chen jolted awake in seat 12F, her neck stiff from sleeping against the small airplane window. The Boeing 777 lurched violently to the left, sending her water bottle rolling down the aisle and triggering a symphony of passenger gasps throughout the darkened cabin. Outside her window, lightning illuminated towering storm clouds that seemed to stretch endlessly into the night sky. She checked her watch. 2:17 a.m. They were somewhere over the Atlantic, 4 hours into the red-eye flight from New York to London. Most of the 287 passengers were asleep or trying to sleep, wrapped in thin airline blankets under the dim, amber glow of the emergency lighting that had apparently replaced the normal cabin illumination. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Another violent shake rattled the aircraft, this one lasting nearly 10 seconds. Sarah gripped her armrests, her pilot's instincts immediately analyzing the movement. This wasn't normal turbulence. The aircraft was fighting something. The engine straining with an unusual whine that most passengers wouldn't notice, but that sent ice through her veins. A flight attendant stumbled past her row, barely catching herself on a seat back. Sarah caught the woman's eye and saw something that terrified her more than the turbulence. Barely controlled panic. That's when the announcement came. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." The voice was steady but carried an undertone that Sarah recognized from her years flying commercial aircraft-controlled emergency protocol. "We're experiencing some technical difficulties and severe weather conditions. As a precautionary measure, we need to ask if there are any qualified pilots among our passengers. If you are a licensed pilot, please press your call button immediately and identify yourself to the flight crew." The cabin fell into absolute silence, except for the groaning of the aircraft's hull and the increasingly labored sound of the engines. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. In 15 years of flying, she had never heard an announcement like that on a passenger flight. Captains didn't ask for pilot assistance unless something was catastrophically wrong. She pressed her call. Buttoned up the flight attendant, Maria, according to her name tag, appeared beside her within seconds, moving with the practiced urgency of someone following emergency procedures. "Are you a pilot?" Maria asked, leaning close to be heard over the storm. "Captain Sarah Chen, former United Airlines, currently with NetJets. ATP license, type-rated on Boeing 777s. Sarah's voice was calm, professional, automatically falling into the clipped tone she used in cockpits during emergencies. "What's the situation?" Maria's face went white. "The captain needs to speak with you immediately. Can you come forward?" Sarah unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, ignoring the continued turbulence that threatened to knock her sideways. As she followed Maria toward the front of the aircraft, she caught fragments of whispered conversations from passengers who were now fully awake and increasingly anxious. What did they mean, technical difficulties? Why do they need another pilot? Are we going to crash? Sarah pushed those voices aside and focused on what she might be walking into. The aircraft's movements were becoming more erratic, and through the windows, she could see they were deep inside the storm system with no signs of clear air ahead. But more troubling was the sound of the engines, the slight irregularity that suggested power management issues, possibly related to the storm, or something worse. As they approached the cockpit door, Maria turned to her with tears in her eyes. "Captain Rodriguez collapsed 20 minutes ago," she whispered. "The first officer is flying alone, and the weather. God help us all." The cockpit of Oceanic Flight 447 was a maze of flashing warning lights and urgent chimes when Sarah stepped through the reinforced door. First Officer James Mitchell looked up from the controls with obvious relief, his face pale and strained under the red glow of the emergency lighting. "Thank God," he breathed. "I'm Jim Mitchell." Captain Rodriguez is in the back galley. He collapsed. During the storm entry, paramedic passenger is with him, but it looks like a heart attack. Sarah quickly scanned the instrument panel, her eyes automatically processing the cascade of warnings and alerts. Engine parameters were fluctuating wildly. The weather radar showed solid red precipitation for miles ahead. And most concerning, the autopilot was disengaged with the aircraft in manual control. "How long have you been hand-flying in these conditions?" she asked, sliding into the captain's seat and immediately beginning her assessment of their situation. 47 minutes, Jim replied, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool cockpit air. Autopilot kicked off when we hit the storm wall. Captain Rodriguez was helping me manage the engine issues when he just dropped. Sarah's hands moved across the controls with practiced efficiency, her muscle memory taking over 15 years of commercial aviation experience. She adjusted the flight path slightly, feeling the aircraft's response through the yoke, and checked their current position on the navigation display. "We're approximately 800 miles east of Newfoundland," she observed, noting their location relative to potential diversion airports. "What's our fuel status?" 17,000 pounds remaining. We were planning to arrive in London with normal reserves, but fighting this weather is burning fuel faster than calculated. Sarah nodded grimly. 17,000 pounds sounded like a lot to passengers, but at their current fuel burn rate in storm conditions, they had perhaps 3.5 hours of flight time remaining. London was still over 4 hours away, and turning back to North America would take nearly as long. "Jim, I need you to get on the radio with Gander Control," she said, her voice steady and authoritative. "Declare a pan-pan situation, captain incapacitated, severe weather, and request priority routing to the nearest suitable airport. Also ask for medical advice frequency for Captain Rodriguez." As Jim began coordinating with air traffic control, Sarah focused on the immediate crisis of keeping the aircraft stable in the violent storm. The Boeing 777 was being battered by winds that shifted direction and intensity every few seconds, creating a constant battle to maintain altitude and heading. Outside the windscreen, lightning provided brief, brilliant illuminations of the towering cumulonimbus, clouds surrounding them. The weather radar painted a grim picture. They were trapped in the center of a massive storm system with no clear path out. The red and magenta returns on the screen indicated severe turbulence and possible hail, conditions that could seriously damage the aircraft if they encountered the worst areas. "Gander Control is offering us Keflavik, Iceland," Jim reported. "It's our closest option at about 2.5 hours flight time, but we'd have to deviate significantly north to avoid the worst of this storm system." Sarah considered their options. Keflavik was a good airport with excellent medical facilities, but the deviation would add precious time and fuel burn to their flight. However, continuing toward London through this weather was becoming increasingly dangerous. "What's the weather at Keflavik?" she asked. "Overcast, light rain, winds 270 at 15 knots. Essentially VFR conditions. That's our best option. Tell Gander we're accepting the routing to Keflavik and request immediate clearance for the deviation." Sarah began programming the flight management computer with their new destination, while simultaneously fighting the controls to keep the aircraft stable. A particularly violent updraft caught the Boeing 777, throwing it upward nearly 1,000 feet in seconds before dropping it just as quickly. Several passengers screamed from the cabin behind them, and Sarah heard what sounded like the crash of galley equipment breaking free from its restraints. "How's Captain Rodriguez?" Sarah called back to Maria, who had remained near the cockpit door. "The paramedic says his vitals are stable, but he's unconscious. She thinks it was definitely a heart attack, probably brought on by the stress of the emergency." Sarah absorbed this information while continuing to manage the aircraft's flight. Through the storm, Captain Rodriguez was a veteran pilot with over 20,000 flight hours. If the stress of this situation had triggered his heart attack, it spoke to just how serious their predicament truly was. "Jim, what's our passenger manifest? Any other pilots aboard?" Jim consulted his paperwork. "According to the manifest, we have you and one other person who identified themselves as having a pilot's license when they checked in, but no additional airline pilots. Get someone back there to find that other pilot and bring them forward. If this situation gets worse, we're going to need all the qualified help we can get." Through the storm, Sarah could see other aircraft on her traffic display, all requesting deviations around the same weather system that had trapped them. The North Atlantic was one of the busiest oceanic routes in the world, with dozens of flights crossing every hour. Tonight, all of them were dealing with the same massive storm front. Oceanic 447, Gander Control, turn left heading 350. Climb and maintain flight level 390. Be advised, several aircraft are reporting severe turbulence and icing conditions in your area. Use extreme caution. Sarah acknowledged the clearance and began the climb, feeling the aircraft strain against the violent air currents. Ice was indeed beginning to accumulate on the windscreen, despite their de-icing systems running at full capacity. The outside air temperature had dropped to -47 degrees Celsius, cold enough for the moisture in the clouds to instantly freeze on any surface. "Engine anti-ice is on, wing anti-ice is on," Jim reported, running through the severe weather checklist. "Pitot heat confirmed on all systems." These were critical systems in icing conditions. If ice accumulated on the engine inlets, it could cause compressor stalls or even engine failure. If it built up on the wing surfaces, it would destroy the airfoil's ability to generate lift. And if ice blocked the pitot tubes that measured airspeed, they could lose accurate flight data entirely. As if summoned by her thoughts, a new warning light illuminated on the instrument panel. ANTIICE. Fail. Sarah's blood ran cold. Engine number 2, the right engine, had just lost its anti-icing protection. In their current conditions, that engine was now vulnerable to ice ingestion, which could cause anything from power fluctuations to complete failure. "Jim, monitor engine 2 parameters closely. Any fluctuation in N1 or EGT, and we may need to reduce power on that engine." "Roger. So far parameters look normal, but I'll watch it carefully." Behind them, another passenger was making their way forward, a man in his 50s wearing a business suit, moving carefully through the turbulent cabin. "I'm David Park," he said as he reached the cockpit. "I have a private pilot's license and about 800 hours, mostly in single-engine aircraft. I understand you need assistance." Sarah looked him over quickly. He seemed calm and competent, which was exactly what they needed. "David, we've got an incapacitated captain, severe weather, and now anti-icing issues. Have you ever been in a commercial cockpit before?" "No, but I'm a retired electrical engineer, and I understand complex systems. Tell me how I can help." "Right now, I need you to monitor our passenger situation. We've got nearly 300 people back there who are scared and getting more anxious by the minute. Work with the flight attendants to keep everyone calm and informed. If this situation deteriorates further, we may need to prepare for an emergency landing, and passenger management will be critical." David nodded seriously. "I understand. I'll coordinate with the cabin crew and report back if there are any significant issues." As David headed back into the cabin, another violent downdraft caught the aircraft, this one dropping them nearly 1,500 feet in a matter of seconds. The negative G-forces lifted Sarah against her restraints, and she heard the unmistakable sound of items crashing around in the cabin behind them. "Structural inspection," she called to Jim. "As soon as we get through this turbulence, I need you to ask the flight attendants to check for any visible damage to the cabin or signs of structural stress. The Boeing 777 was built to handle severe turbulence, but every aircraft had its limits. The forces they were experiencing were approaching the maximum design tolerances, and repeated stress cycles could potentially cause fatigue damage to critical components. Oceanic 447, Gander Control, radar shows you're encountering the most intense part of the storm system. Expect conditions to begin improving in approximately 30 minutes as you track north of the main cell. 30 minutes felt like an eternity when every second was a battle to keep the aircraft under control, but it was welcome news. They needed to emerge from this storm system before something else went wrong. As if on cue, a new alarm chimed in. The cockpit, the engine number 2 parameters were beginning to fluctuate. The engine number 2 exhaust gas temperature spiked to 927 degrees Celsius before settling back into normal range. But Sarah had seen enough engine failures to know this was just the beginning. Ice was accumulating somewhere in the engine system despite their best efforts, and the anti-ice failure was going to become a serious problem very quickly. "Jim, reduce power on engine 2 to 70% N1, she ordered, her hands steady on the controls despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "We need to minimize ice ingestion until we can get out of these conditions." "Reducing power engine 2, Jim acknowledged, moving the thrust lever carefully. The aircraft immediately yawed slightly to the left as the power differential between the engines increased, requiring Sarah to adjust the rudder trim to maintain coordinated flight. Flying on reduced power in a severe storm was like trying to climb a mountain with one leg injured, possible, but exponentially more dangerous. The Boeing 777 was designed to handle single-engine operations, but in their current conditions, every bit of available power was crucial for maintaining altitude and airspeed. "How are we doing on fuel with the new routing to Keflavik?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Jim consulted the fuel management page on his display. "At our current consumption rate, we'll arrive with about 2,000 pounds remaining. That's well below company minimums, but legal for an emergency situation." 2,000 pounds was uncomfortably close to fumes, but it would have to do. In aviation, you could always question the fuel load afterwards, but you couldn't add fuel in flight. They were committed to their course of action now. Behind them, Maria appeared in the cockpit doorway again, her expression grim. "Captain Chen, we need to discuss the passenger situation. People are getting very scared, and we've had several injuries from the turbulence. Nothing life-threatening, but we have at least 6 people with cuts and bruises. Also, Captain Rodriguez is still unconscious, and the paramedic says his blood pressure is dropping." Sarah absorbed this information while continuing to fight the controls. The aircraft was still being battered by the storm, making it impossible to maintain a steady altitude or heading for more than a few seconds at a time. Every muscle in her body ached from the constant corrections required to keep them flying straight and level. "Maria, I need you to prepare the cabin for the possibility of an emergency landing. Don't announce it to the passengers yet, but brief your crew on emergency procedures and make sure all emergency equipment is accessible. Also, ask the paramedic if Captain Rodriguez can be safely moved to a seat with a proper restraint system. What about the passengers? They can tell something serious is happening." Sarah considered this carefully. Passenger management during emergencies was a delicate balance between keeping people informed and preventing panic. Too little information led to anxiety and rumors, but too much detail about their actual situation could cause a mass panic that would make everything worse. "Make an announcement that we've encountered severe weather and are diverting to Iceland as a precautionary measure. Tell them we have qualified pilots managing the situation and that we expect to be on the ground within 2.5 hours. Don't mention Captain Rodriguez's condition or the engine issues." Maria nodded and headed back into the cabin to coordinate with her crew. Sarah could hear her making the announcement over the passenger address system, her voice professionally calm despite the circumstances. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Maria speaking from the flight crew. Due to severe weather conditions over the Atlantic, we are diverting to Keflavik Airport in Iceland as a precautionary measure. We have experienced pilots managing the situation, and we expect to land safely in approximately 2.5 hours. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened, and our crew will continue to assist you throughout the flight. Thank you for your patience and cooperation. The announcement seemed to calm the passenger noise somewhat, though Sarah could still hear anxious conversations throughout the cabin. She turned her attention back to the immediate challenge of flying through the storm, while managing their deteriorating engine situation. Engine 2 EGT is climbing again, Jim reported. 940 degrees and rising. Reduce power to 60%, Sarah ordered. If it hits maximum temperature, we'll have to shut it down entirely. The thought of flying through this storm on a single engine sent a chill through her, but it was a real possibility. The Boeing 777 was certified for extended twin-engine operations, meaning it could safely fly on one engine for hours if necessary. But their current weather conditions were far from the ideal scenarios used for certification testing. Outside the cockpit windows, the lightning was becoming less frequent, suggesting they might be approaching the edge of the storm system. The turbulence was still severe, but Sarah thought she could detect a slight improvement in the aircraft stability. Every minute that passed without a new emergency was a victory. Oceanic 447, Gander Control, radar shows you're beginning to track out of the most severe precipitation. Continue present heading and expect smoother conditions in approximately 15 minutes. Finally, some good news, Jim muttered, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. Sarah allowed herself a moment of cautious optimism, but her experience had taught her that aviation emergencies rarely resolve themselves cleanly. They still had 2 hours of flight time ahead of them, an incapacitated captain, a potentially failing engine, and nearly 300 passengers whose lives depended on their ability to get this aircraft safely on the ground. Jim, start setting up the approach for Keflavik. I want the ILS frequency loaded, runway data confirmed, and weather updated. Also, coordinate with Iceland ATC for medical assistance on arrival. We're going to need paramedics standing by for Captain Rodriguez. As Jim began working the radios and navigation systems, Sarah felt the aircraft's ride beginning to smooth out slightly. The constant buffeting was decreasing, and she was able to maintain altitude within 100 feet rather than the wild swings they'd been experiencing. Then David Park appeared at the cockpit door again, his expression troubled. Captain Chen, we have a situation developing in the passenger cabin, he said quietly. There's a group of passengers in the middle section who are becoming increasingly agitated. They're demanding to know what's really happening and threatening to rush the cockpit if they don't get answers. Sarah's heart sank. This was exactly the scenario she'd been hoping to avoid: panic that could compromise their ability to manage the emergency. A group of panicked passengers attempting to storm the cockpit could be catastrophic, especially with the aircraft still in marginal flying conditions. How many passengers are we talking about? She asked. Maybe 8 to 10, but they're getting others worked up. The flight attendants are trying to manage the situation, but these people are scared and angry. Sarah made a decision that went against standard protocols, but seemed necessary given their circumstances. David, I'm going to make an announcement directly to the passengers. Sometimes hearing from the person actually flying the airplane can calm people down better than crew announcements. She reached for the passenger address microphone, knowing that what she said in the next few minutes could make the difference between a manageable emergency and a complete disaster. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Sarah Chen speaking from the flight deck. I'm a qualified airline captain who was traveling as a passenger and volunteered to assist with our current situation. I want to give you an honest assessment of where we stand." The cabin fell completely silent behind her. "We encountered a severe storm system over the Atlantic. That damaged some of our aircraft systems and caused a medical emergency with our original captain. We are diverting to Iceland, which has excellent medical facilities and airport services. The aircraft is flying safely, and we expect to land in approximately 2 hours and 15 minutes. I understand your frightened severe turbulence is scary, even for experienced pilots. But I want to assure you that this aircraft is designed to handle these conditions, and we have multiple backup systems for every critical function." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I need your help to get everyone home safely. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened, listen to the flight attendants, and be patient with us as we work through this situation. Aviation is an incredibly safe form of transportation precisely because we train for emergencies like this and have procedures to handle them. Thank you for your cooperation." The effect was immediate and obvious. The anxious chatter in the cabin died down considerably, and Sarah could sense a collective exhale of relief. Sometimes passengers just needed to hear confidence and competence from the person responsible for their safety. "That was well done," Jim commented. "You struck the right balance between honesty and reassurance." Sarah nodded, but her attention was already back on the engine parameters. Engine number 2 was still running hot, and they were far from out of danger as they emerged from the worst of the storm system. Sarah allowed herself to believe they might actually make it to Keflavik without further complications. The turbulence had decreased to light chop, and she was able to engage the autopilot for the first time in over an hour, giving her aching arms a much-needed rest. Autopilot engaged. Altitude 39,000, heading 355 degrees, she announced, following standard crew coordination procedures, even though Jim was clearly aware of what she was doing. Good communication in the cockpit could prevent mistakes, especially during high-stress situations. "Roger, autopilot engaged," Jim acknowledged. "Engine parameters are stabilizing on engine 2. EGT is holding steady at 910 degrees, which is high but within acceptable limits." Sarah pulled up the fuel management page on her display and recalculated their arrival numbers. With the reduced power setting on engine 2, their fuel consumption had actually improved slightly, giving them a more comfortable margin for landing in Iceland. "Fuel remaining shows 3,400 pounds at Keflavik arrival," she reported. "That's better than our earlier calculations." "Good news for once," Jim replied. "Iceland Approach Control is standing by for our arrival, and they've arranged for medical personnel to meet the aircraft." Behind them, the cabin had settled into an uneasy calm. Sarah could hear quiet conversations and the occasional crying child, but the sense of immediate panic had subsided. The flight attendants were moving through the cabin, checking on injured passengers and providing reassurance. David Park returned to the cockpit with an update. "The situation in the cabin is much more manageable now. Your announcement really helped calm people down. The paramedic says Captain Rodriguez is stable but still unconscious, and she's moved him to a seat where she can monitor him more easily." "How are our injured passengers?" Sarah asked. "Nothing serious, cuts and bruises, mostly from people being thrown around during the worst turbulence. One woman has a possible sprained wrist, but she's being treated with ice and pain medication." Sarah was relieved that they hadn't sustained more serious injuries during the violent turbulence. She'd seen reports of flights where severe weather had caused broken bones and head injuries when passengers were thrown against cabin structures. "David, I want you to coordinate with the flight attendants on emergency landing preparations. I don't expect we'll need them, but I want everyone ready just in case something else goes wrong before we reach Keflavik." "What specifically should we prepare for?" Sarah considered the question carefully. In her experience, emergencies in aviation rarely came alone. Problems tended to cascade as stress systems failed in sequence. Their engine situation was stable for now, but ice damage could have affected other systems they hadn't discovered yet. Review the emergency evacuation procedures with the cabin crew. Make sure all emergency exits are accessible, and identify any passengers who might be able to assist in an emergency. Military personnel, medical professionals, anyone with relevant experience. As David headed back into the cabin, a new concern occurred to Sarah. She pulled up the weather information for Keflavik and studied the forecast carefully. "Jim, what's the current weather at our destination?" Last report showed overcast at 800 feet, visibility 6 miles and light rain, winds 280 at 12 knots. The weather was certainly flyable, but the overcast ceiling at 800 feet meant they would need to execute an instrument approach down to near minimums. In normal circumstances, this wouldn't be a concern, but with their engine situation and an unfamiliar crew configuration, every additional challenge multiplied their risk. "Let's brief the ILS approach to runway 19, Sarah said. "I want to review every detail before we begin our descent." For the next 20 minutes, they went through the instrument approach procedure, step by step, discussing altitudes, speeds, missed approach procedures, and emergency protocols. This kind of detailed briefing was standard practice for professional pilots, but it was especially critical when dealing with abnormal conditions. Oceanic 447, Reykjavik Control, good evening. We have you on radar, approximately 150 miles southeast of Keflavik. Descend and maintain flight level 240. Expect vectors for the ILS approach runway 19. Reykjavik Control, Oceanic 447. Leaving flight level 390 for flight level 240, Sarah responded, beginning their descent toward Iceland. As they descended through the cloud layers, Sarah felt the familiar mixture of relief and apprehension that came with the final phase of any emergency flight. They were close to safety, but these last 30 minutes were often the most dangerous as crews dealt with fatigue, stress, and the complexity of getting the aircraft safely on the ground. 1 hour and 23 minutes of flight time remaining. Jim reported. All systems stable except for engine 2 anti-ice. Sarah nodded and began configuring the aircraft for the approach phase of flight. They would need to slow down, extend flaps and landing gear, and execute a precision approach through low clouds to a runway they'd never seen before, all while managing an engine that was running on borrowed time. "Cabin crew, prepare cabin for landing," she announced over the intercom. Estimated time to touchdown is 1 hour and 15 minutes. Through her headset, she could hear the flight attendants beginning the landing preparation, routine securing galley equipment, checking passenger seatbelts, and preparing the emergency equipment that she hoped they wouldn't need. The lights of Reykjavik were beginning to appear through the clouds below, a welcome sight after hours of flying over the dark Atlantic Ocean. Iceland looked peaceful and safe from their altitude, though Sarah knew the approach and landing would require all of her concentration and skill. "Engine 2 EGT is climbing again," Jim announced, breaking into her thoughts. 920 degrees and rising slowly. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. They were so close to safety, but their marginal engine was choosing the worst possible time to deteriorate further. "If it reaches 950, we'll have to shut it down," she said, knowing that landing a heavy commercial aircraft on a single engine, while possible, would significantly increase their risk. "Understood. I'm monitoring it closely." Behind them, she could hear Maria making another announcement to the passengers, preparing them for landing while carefully avoiding any mention of their engine problems. The passengers had been through enough already. They didn't need to know that their emergency might be about to get worse. As they continued their descent toward Iceland, Sarah ran through the single-engine approach procedures in her mind, hoping she wouldn't need to use them, but preparing for the possibility that their emergency was far from over. The lights of Keflavik Airport were now visible in the distance, a beacon of safety in North Atlantic night. But between their current position and that runway lay 30 more minutes of flying, 30 minutes in which anything could happen. Oceanic 447, Reykjavik control. Turn left heading 270. Descend and maintain 8,000 feet. You're cleared for the ILS approach runway 1 established on the localizer. Sarah acknowledged the clearance and began the complex process of configuring the Boeing 777 for approach. The aircraft needed to slow from its cruise speed of nearly 500 knots to approach speed of around 160 knots, while simultaneously descending from altitude and aligning with the instrument landing system that would guide them to the runway. Flaps 5, she called, extending the first stage of flaps to begin the deceleration process. Flaps 5, green light, Jim confirmed. Monitoring the flap position indicators, the aircraft's descent through the cloud layers was smooth compared to their earlier ordeal in the storm. But Sarah remained hyper-vigilant for any signs of icing or turbulence. The outside air temperature had dropped to -12 degrees Celsius, cold enough for ice formation if they encountered any moisture. Engine 2 EGT is holding steady at 930 degrees, Jim reported. Still hot, but not climbing. Sarah nodded, keeping one eye on the engine parameters while managing the approach. They were in a delicate balancing act. The engine was running hot enough to be concerning, but shutting it down would significantly complicate their landing. As long as the temperature stayed below the maximum limit, they could continue with both engines. Gear down, she called as they intercepted the localizer beam that would guide them laterally to the runway. The landing gear extended with its characteristic rumble and vibration, and Sarah felt the aircraft slow further as the gear created additional drag. She adjusted the power settings to maintain their approach speed, carefully avoiding any unnecessary stress on the problematic engine 2. Gear down, 3 green, Jim confirmed. Before landing checklist complete. Through the cloud layer, the approach lights of runway 19 appeared like a string of pearls in the darkness. After hours of flying through storms and emergency conditions, the sight of a normal, well-lit runway was almost emotional. Runway in sight, Sarah announced. Continuing visual approach. But their relief was premature. As they descended through 400 feet above ground level, engine number 2 finally succumbed to the ice damage it had been fighting for hours. The engine seized with a violent shudder that Sarah felt through the entire aircraft structure, followed immediately by a master warning alarm and a cascade of red lights on the engine display. Engine number 2's parameters plummeted to 0 as the engine automatically shut down, leaving them flying on single-engine power at the most critical phase of flight. Engine failure, engine 2. Jim called out, immediately running the engine failure checklist from memory. Sarah's response was instantaneous and automatic, the result of hundreds of hours of simulator training for exactly this scenario. She applied left rudder to counteract the yaw caused by the asymmetric thrust, adjusted the power on the remaining engine to maintain approach speed, and continued flying the approach with mechanical precision. Single engine approach, continue. To landing, she announced, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. The Boeing 777 was designed for this situation, but flying a single-engine approach at night, in marginal weather, with an unfamiliar crew, pushed the boundaries of even the most advanced aircraft systems. Sarah had to constantly adjust for the tendency of the aircraft to yaw and roll toward the failed engine, while maintaining the precise flight path required for a safe landing. Flaps 30, landing checklist, she called as they passed through 200 feet. Flaps 30, landing checklist complete, Jim responded, his voice tense but professional. In the cabin behind them, passengers had felt the sudden vibration and power change, and anxious voices were rising again. Sarah could hear Maria trying to calm people, but there was no disguising the fact that something significant had just happened. 100 feet, Jim called out their altitude. The runway was rushing up to meet them, its lights creating a corridor of safety in the darkness. Sarah made final adjustments to their flight path, fighting the aircraft's tendency to drift right due to the single-engine configuration. 50 feet, 40, 30, 10... The main landing gear touched down with a satisfying thump, followed immediately by the nose gear. Sarah deployed the speed brakes and applied wheel brakes, while Jim deployed the reverse thrust on their remaining engine. The aircraft accelerated rapidly, and within 30 seconds, they were traveling at taxi speed on the runway. Oceanic 447, catastrophic tower, nice job. Turn left at taxiway Charlie and contact ground control on frequency 121.9. Emergency equipment is standing by. Sarah looked out her side window and saw the flashing lights of fire trucks and ambulances following them as they taxied toward the terminal. The sight of emergency vehicles was both reassuring and sobering, a reminder of how close they had come to a potentially catastrophic situation. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Chen. We have landed safely at Keflavik Airport in Iceland. Please remain seated while the aircraft comes to a complete stop and emergency personnel assess our situation. Thank you for your patience and cooperation during this difficult flight. As they reached the gate, Sarah finally allowed herself to exhale fully for the first time in over 3 hours. They were on the ground, all passengers and crew were alive, and their emergency was effectively over. But she knew the next few hours would bring new challenges as they dealt with the aftermath of their ordeal. The Keflavik Airport terminal was blazing with activity as Oceanic Flight 447 came to a complete stop at Gate 12. Sarah could see ground crews and emergency personnel positioning themselves around the aircraft, their practiced movements illuminated by the powerful floodlights that had been brought in to assist with the emergency response. Parking brake set, shutdown checklist, Sarah announced, beginning the process of securing the aircraft systems. Jim worked through the shutdown procedures with methodical precision, but Sarah noticed his hands were trembling slightly, the delayed stress response that often hit pilots after successfully managing a serious emergency. She'd experienced it herself many times and knew it was a normal physiological reaction. A PU started, external power connected, Jim reported. All systems are secure. Through the cockpit windows, Sarah could see the jet bridge being positioned to connect with their aircraft. More importantly, she spotted the ambulance crew wheeling a stretcher toward the aircraft door help for Captain Rodriguez, who had remained unconscious throughout their emergency approach and landing. Maria appeared at the cockpit door, looking exhausted but relieved. Captain Chen, the paramedic says Captain Rodriguez's condition is stable, but he needs immediate hospital transport. The passengers are anxious to deplane, but they're following instructions to remain seated. How are our injured passengers holding up? Sarah asked. Everyone who was hurt during the turbulence is in stable condition. The woman with the sprained wrist is in some pain, but she'll be fine until we can get her to medical facilities. Sarah nodded and turned to Jim. I need to coordinate with the authorities and the airline about our situation. Can you handle the shutdown procedures and work with the ground crew on the aircraft inspection? Absolutely. I'll also need to secure the flight data recorder and voice recorder for the incident investigation. This was standard procedure after any emergency event. The digital flight recorders would provide investigators with precise information about the aircraft's performance, crew actions, and the sequence of events that led to their emergency situation. David Park appeared behind Maria, still carrying himself with the calm competence he'd shown throughout the crisis. Captain Chen, I wanted to thank you before the chaos gets too intense. What you did tonight taking control of an emergency, that wasn't even your responsibility. That takes real courage. I'm just glad we all made it safely, Sarah replied. You helped keep the passengers calm, which was just as important as anything that happened in the cockpit. As she prepared to leave the aircraft, Sarah realized that her impromptu role as captain of Flight 447 was far from over. There would be interviews with Icelandic aviation authorities, coordination with Oceanic Airlines about passenger accommodations, and eventually a detailed investigation into the engine failure and Captain Rodriguez's medical emergency. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her NetJet scheduler. Saw the news about Flight 447. Are you okay? Call when you can. The news. Sarah hadn't even considered that their emergency might have attracted media attention, but a transatlantic flight diverting to Iceland due to multiple emergencies was exactly the kind of story that aviation reporters love to cover. Captain Chen? A man in an official-looking uniform was approaching from the jet bridge. I'm Captain Eric Magnuson with the Icelandic Aviation Authority. We need to debrief this incident while the details are fresh in everyone's minds. Sarah gathered her belongings from the cockpit, taking one last look at the instrument panel that had been her window into the aircraft systems for the past 3 hours. The Engine 2 display still showed all zeros, a stark reminder of how close they had come to a much more serious situation. The Keflavik Airport Emergency Response Center had been converted into a coordination hub for dealing with the Flight 447 incident. Sarah found herself in a small conference room with Captain Magnuson, Jim Mitchell, and a representative from Oceanic Airlines who had apparently been roused from sleep and was participating via video conference from the company's Operations Center in New York. Captain Chen, the airline representative, began. I'm Thomas Wayne, Director of Flight Operations for Oceanic. First, I want to thank you for your assistance in this emergency. Your actions likely prevented a much more serious outcome. Sarah nodded acknowledgement, but remained focused on the official debriefing process. In aviation, praise came later. Right now, they needed to establish the facts of what had happened and ensure that any safety issues were properly addressed. Captain Magnuson, what's the status of Captain Rodriguez? She asked. He's been transported to Landspítala University Hospital in Reykjavik. Initial diagnosis confirms a myocardial infarction, a heart attack, but he's stable and conscious now. Doctors expect a full recovery with appropriate treatment. That was the best news Sarah had heard all night. Captain Rodriguez was a fellow professional, and knowing he would recover removed one major weight from her mind. Now let's discuss the engine failure. Captain Magnuson continued, consulting his notes. First Officer Mitchell, walk me through the sequence of events leading up to the engine shutdown. Jim described the progressive deterioration of Engine 2, from the initial anti-ice system failure through the increasing exhaust gas temperatures to the final seizure during approach. His account was precise and professional, exactly what investigators needed to understand the mechanical issues. Captain Chen, from your perspective as the pilot in command during the emergency, what was your assessment of the aircraft's condition and capabilities? Sarah organized her thoughts carefully. Her words would become part of the official record and could influence future safety recommendations. The aircraft performed exactly as designed throughout the emergency. The flight control systems compensated effectively for the engine failure, and all backup systems functioned properly. The Boeing 777 proved its capability to handle multiple system failures while maintaining safe flight operations. What about the passenger management aspect? We understand there were some concerns about passenger behavior during the crisis. There was one period where a group of passengers became agitated and demanding answers about our situation. I made a decision to address them directly via the passenger announcement system, which seemed to calm the situation effectively. Thomas Wayne leaned forward in the video conference. Captain Chen, that was exactly the right decision. We've reviewed the cockpit voice recorder transcripts, and your passenger announcements struck the perfect balance between honesty and reassurance. Captain Magnuson made notes and continued his questioning. Looking back on the entire event, Is there anything you would have done differently? Sarah considered this carefully. Second-guessing was dangerous in aviation. It could lead to hesitation during future emergencies, but honest assessment was crucial for improving safety procedures. With the benefit of hindsight, I might have declared a full emergency rather than just a pan-pan situation earlier in the flight. That would have given us priority handling from air traffic control and might have reduced our time in the severe weather. However, given the information available at the time, I believe our decisions were appropriate. What about crew resource management? How did you and First Officer Mitchell work together, given that you'd never flown together before? Jim performed exceptionally well under extremely difficult circumstances. His technical knowledge and professionalism were critical to our success. The challenge of working with an unfamiliar crew member was offset by both of our training and experience with standard operating procedures. The debriefing continued for another hour, covering every aspect of the emergency from the initial storm encounter through the single-engine landing. Sarah found the process helpful for organizing her own thoughts about the experience and identifying any lessons that could benefit future emergency responses. Captain Chen, Thomas Wayne said as they wrapped up, Oceanic Airlines would like to offer you a position with our company. Tonight demonstrated exactly the kind of skill and judgment we value in our pilots. Sarah was surprised by the offer, but not ready to make any career decisions in the immediate aftermath of the emergency. I appreciate that, Mr. Wayne, but I'm very happy with my current position at NetJets. However, I'd be honored to participate in any training programs or safety initiatives that might benefit from tonight's experience. Of course, we'll be in touch about that. For now, the company is arranging hotel accommodations for all passengers and crew, while we work on getting everyone to their final destinations. As the official debriefing concluded, Sarah realized she was exhausted. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the emergency was wearing off, leaving her drained but oddly satisfied. They had faced a serious situation and handled it professionally, and everyone was going home safely. By morning, the story of Flight 447's emergency landing was making headlines around the aviation world. Sarah woke up in her hotel room to find her phone buzzing with calls from reporters, aviation safety organizations, and pilot groups wanting to discuss the incident. The headline in Aviation Week read, "Off-duty pilot saves 287 lives in mid-Atlantic emergency." The article accurately described the basic facts of their situation, but added a dramatic flair that made Sarah slightly uncomfortable. Jim Mitchell knocked on her door at 8 a.m., looking as tired as she felt. "Have you seen the news coverage?" he asked. "Unfortunately, yes. I've been dodging reporter calls for the past hour. CNN wants to interview both of us about crew resource management during emergencies." The reporter said it's a perfect example of how aviation safety systems work even under extreme stress. Sarah poured coffee from the small hotel room maker and offered a cup to Jim. "What do you think about doing interviews? Part of me wants to just go home and forget this ever happened." "I understand that feeling, but I think we have an obligation to share what we learned. Other pilots might face similar situations, and our experience could help them prepare." Sarah knew Jim was right. Aviation safety improved through the sharing of experiences, both positive and negative. Pilots learned from each other's successes and mistakes, building a collective knowledge base that made flying safer for everyone. "Okay, but I want to be careful about how we frame this. It wasn't heroic, it was just professional pilots doing their jobs under difficult circumstances." "Agreed. The real heroes were the passengers who stayed calm and the flight attendants who managed the cabin during a terrifying situation." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Sarah opened it to find David Park, the private pilot who had helped coordinate passenger management during the crisis. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said. I wanted to thank you both again and let you know that several passengers are organizing a letter to Oceanic Airlines praising your actions." "That's very kind but unnecessary," Sarah replied. "We were just doing our jobs." "Maybe, but you chose to get involved when you could have stayed in your seat and let someone else handle the crisis. That says something about your character." David's words reminded Sarah of something she'd been trying not to think about, the moment when she'd made the decision to press her call button and volunteer to help. It would have been easy to stay anonymous, to let the first officer handle the emergency alone, to avoid the responsibility and stress of taking command. "David, can I ask you something? You're a private pilot. You understood how serious our situation was. Were you tempted to volunteer to help in the cockpit?" David smiled ruefully. "Absolutely, but I also understood my limitations. My 800 hours in single-engine aircraft wouldn't have been much help in a Boeing 777 cockpit. Sometimes the best way to help is to recognize what you can and can't contribute." That insight impressed Sarah. Aviation was full of pilots who overestimated their abilities, and David's self-awareness was refreshing. "What do you do when you're not flying?" she asked. "I'm a systems engineer for a tech company in Seattle. I design backup systems for data centers, redundancy planning, failure mode analysis, that sort of thing." In some ways, it's similar to aviation. We try to anticipate what could go wrong and make sure there are backup plans. Sarah found herself intrigued by David's background. The parallels between aviation safety and information technology disaster planning were closer than most people realized. "Would you be interested in participating in a safety presentation about last night? I'm thinking about putting together a program for pilot training organizations. I'd be honored to help. The passenger perspective during an emergency is something that doesn't get discussed much in pilot training." Jim finished his coffee and stood up. "I need to get back to the airport. The aircraft investigation team wants to interview me about the engine failure sequence." After Jim left, Sarah and David continued talking about the previous night's events and their implications for aviation safety. She found his analytical approach to problems refreshing, and his insights into passenger psychology during emergencies were valuable. "Sarah," David said after a pause, "I hope this doesn't sound forward, but would you like to have dinner tonight? I know we're both stuck in Iceland until the airline sorts out replacement flights, and I'd enjoy continuing our conversation." Sarah hesitated. Her post-emergency emotional state was probably not the best time to make social decisions, but she found herself genuinely interested in David's perspectives on risk management and systems thinking. "I'd like that," she said. "But let's keep it casual. We've both been through enough stress for one trip." As David left to join other passengers for the airline-arranged tour of Reykjavik, Sarah reflected on how quickly her simple red-eye flight to London had transformed into a life-changing experience. She'd gained new professional insights, possibly made lasting friendships, and demonstrated to herself that her decision to become a pilot had been the right choice. But she also knew the investigation was just beginning, and the full implications of Flight 447's emergency landing were yet to be understood. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The aircraft hangar at Keflavik Airport had been transformed into an investigation headquarters. Sarah arrived at 9 a.m. to find teams of technicians swarming over the Boeing 777, documenting every detail of the engine failure and storm damage. Lead investigator, Captain Helga Eriksdottir from the Icelandic Transportation Safety Board greeted Sarah at the hangar entrance. "Captain Chen, thank you for coming. We have some initial findings that we'd like to discuss with you." The failed engine had been removed from the aircraft and was being examined on a specialized test stand. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the extent of the ice damage. The compressor blades were severely eroded, and several sections showed signs of catastrophic failure. "What's the preliminary assessment?" Sarah asked. Engine failure was caused by massive ice ingestion through the damaged anti-ice system. However, we're finding some concerning secondary issues that weren't apparent during your emergency. Captain. Eric's daughter led Sarah to a laptop computer, displaying detailed photographs of the engine interior. The images showed damage that went far beyond what they had experienced during flight. If you had continued operating this engine at normal power settings for another 30 minutes, it would have suffered a catastrophic uncontained failure. Pieces of the engine could have penetrated the fuselage or severed control cables. Sarah felt a chill as she absorbed this information. An uncontained engine failure at altitude could have been fatal for everyone aboard, turning their manageable emergency into an unsurvivable disaster. Your decision to reduce power when the EGT started. Climbing probably saved the aircraft, Captain Eric's daughter continued. The question we're investigating now is whether the anti-system failure was a random, mechanical issue or part of a larger problem. What do you mean by a larger problem? We're examining whether this Boeing 777 model has a systemic vulnerability to ice damage under specific weather conditions. If so, the manufacturer and airlines need to know immediately. The implications were staggering. If there was a design flaw in the 777's anti-ice systems, hundreds of aircraft around the world could be at risk. Sarah realized their emergency might be the first indication of a much broader safety issue. "Have there been other incidents with similar symptoms?" she asked. "We're researching that now. The manufacturer has been cooperative in providing technical data, but we need more information about the specific weather conditions you encountered." Sarah spent the next 2 hours providing detailed testimony about the storm system, their flight path, the progression of system failures, and her decision-making process throughout the emergency. Every detail could be crucial for understanding whether other aircraft might face similar situations. Captain Chen, one more question. Given what you know now about the engine's condition, would you have made the same decision to continue to Iceland rather than attempting an immediate emergency? Landing at a closer airport? Sarah considered this carefully. Monday morning quarterbacking was dangerous in aviation, but honest analysis was essential for learning from emergencies. With the information available at the time, continuing to Iceland was the right decision. We had a functioning engine, the aircraft was controllable, and the weather at our destination was good. Attempting to land immediately would have meant flying through more of the storm system, which carried its own risks. But knowing that the engine was on the verge of catastrophic failure, even knowing that, I think the decision was correct. We managed the engine condition by reducing power, which extended its life until we could reach safety. Sometimes in aviation, you have to choose between multiple imperfect options and pick the one with the best chance of success. Captain Eric's daughter made notes and continued her questioning. Sarah realized this investigation would likely continue for months as teams analyzed every aspect of their emergency, from the weather patterns to the crew's decision-making to the aircraft's design and maintenance history. That afternoon, Sarah received a call from an unexpected source, Dr. Amanda Foster, a meteorologist with the National Weather Service who specialized in aviation weather hazards. "Captain Chen, I've been following the investigation into your emergency landing, and I have some information that might be relevant to the inquiry." Sarah was intrigued. She'd learned during her career that aviation safety often depended on expertise from fields beyond piloting, meteorology, engineering, human factor psychology, and many others. "What kind of information, Dr. Foster?" "The storm system you encountered was unusual in several ways. We're tracking it as part of a research project on severe weather over the North Atlantic, and your flight happened to penetrate one of the key most intense cells we've recorded this year." Dr. Foster explained that the storm had produced conditions rarely seen at commercial aviation. Altitudes, extreme supracooled water concentrations, rapid temperature fluctuations, and electromagnetic activity that could affect aircraft systems. The ice accumulation rates in that storm cell were probably 3 to 4 times higher than the certification standards for aircraft anti-ice systems. Your engine didn't fail because of a design flaw, it failed because it encountered conditions beyond what any aircraft is designed to handle. This information was both reassuring and troubling. Reassuring because it suggested the Boeing 777 systems weren't fundamentally flawed, but troubling because it meant other aircraft could face similar situations if they encountered extreme weather. Dr. Foster, how often do these severe conditions occur? That's what we're trying to understand. Climate change is affecting storm patterns over the North Atlantic, and we're seeing more frequent extreme weather events. What happened to your flight might become more common in the future. Sarah realized they were discussing one of aviation's emerging challenges: how to adapt to changing weather patterns that exceeded the conditions aircraft were designed to handle. It was a complex problem that required cooperation between pilots, engineers, meteorologists, and regulators. Would you be willing to participate in a joint presentation about this incident? I think pilot perspectives and meteorological data together could provide valuable insights for the aviation community. Absolutely. I think pilots need to understand these weather hazards better, and meteorologists need to understand how aircraft respond to extreme conditions. After ending the call, Sarah reflected on how her emergency was revealing connections between different fields of expertise. Aviation safety wasn't just about pilot skill or aircraft design. It was a complex system that included weather prediction, air traffic management, airport operations, and emergency response. Her phone rang again, this time showing David Park's number. Sarah, I hope I'm not bothering you, but I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I have an idea I'd like to run past you. What kind of idea? I work with companies on resilience planning, how organizations prepare for and respond to unexpected disruptions. What happened on Flight 447 is a perfect case study in how different people with different skills can work together during a crisis. David explained his thinking. The success of their emergency response hadn't depended only on Sarah's piloting skills or Jim's technical knowledge. It had required coordination between the flight crew, cabin crew, passengers with relevant expertise, ground personnel, and emergency responders. I think there are lessons here that could apply to other high-risk industries: nuclear power, healthcare, financial services, anywhere that people have to make critical decisions under pressure. Sarah found herself intrigued by this broader perspective. She'd always focused on aviation applications of crisis management, but David was suggesting their experience had relevance beyond flying. What are you proposing exactly? A research project examining how expertise networks form during emergencies. You had piloting skills. I had systems engineering background. The paramedic had medical knowledge. The flight attendants had passenger management experience. How did those different capabilities come together to solve the problem? It was an interesting question that Sarah had never considered from an academic perspective. During the emergency, she'd been focused on immediate survival, but David was asking deeper questions about how teams formed and functioned under stress. I'd be interested in exploring that, but I'm not sure how to approach it from a research standpoint. I have contacts at several universities that study organizational behavior and crisis management. Would you be open to participating in some interviews and case study development? Sarah realized that her simple decision to volunteer during an emergency was leading to unexpected opportunities for learning and professional development. The aviation industry would certainly be interested in their experience, but David was suggesting applications in entirely different fields. Let me think about it, she said. Right now I'm still processing what happened, and there's the ongoing investigation to deal with. But yes, I think there could be value in exploring those broader implications. As she ended the call, Sarah realized her life had been fundamentally changed by the events of Flight 447. What had started as a routine overnight flight had evolved into a complex web of professional relationships, research opportunities, and insights into crisis management that extended far beyond aviation. The knock on Sarah's hotel room door at 6 a.m. was forceful and persistent. When she opened it, she found a reporter with a camera crew stationed in the hallway. "Captain Chen, I'm Jennifer Walsh from CNN Aviation. Could we have just a few minutes to discuss your heroic actions aboard Flight 447? Sarah closed the door immediately, but she could hear the reporter continuing to speak through the wood. "Captain Chen, the public has a right to know about aviation safety issues. Your expertise could help other passengers understand what to expect during emergencies." The media attention was becoming overwhelming. Sarah's phone had been ringing constantly with interview requests, and somehow reporters had discovered her hotel location. She understood public interest in aviation stories, but the intense focus on her personal role in the emergency was making her uncomfortable. She called Jim Mitchell. "Are you dealing with reporters too?" "Constantly. I've stopped answering my phone unless I recognize the number. There's a crew from Aviation Daily camped out in the hotel lobby. This is getting out of hand. I became a pilot to fly airplanes, not to be a media personality." "I know, but maybe we should consider doing one carefully controlled interview to satisfy the media interest, and then asking to be left alone." Sarah recognized the wisdom in Jim's suggestion. Sometimes the best way to end media attention was to provide a single comprehensive statement rather than trying to avoid all contact with reporters. "Do you have any preferences for which outlet to work with?" "My vote would be Aviation Week. They understand the technical aspects and are less likely to sensationalize the story." Sarah agreed and spent the morning arranging for a joint interview with Aviation Week's senior safety reporter. They would discuss the emergency from a technical perspective, emphasizing the teamwork aspects and the aircraft's design safety features rather than individual heroics. But the media attention was also bringing unexpected contact from within the aviation community. Sarah received calls from pilot training organizations wanting her to speak at safety seminars, aircraft manufacturers interested in her perspective on emergency procedures, and even academic researchers studying aviation human factors. "Captain Chen, this is Dr. Robert Sterling from the MIT Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics. We're conducting research on pilot decision-making during emergencies, and your Flight 447 experience represents a unique case study." Dr. Sterling explained that most aviation emergency research focused on single-pilot aircraft or situations where the crew had trained together extensively. Sarah's situation taking command of an unfamiliar aircraft with an unfamiliar crew during a complex emergency provided insights into improvised leadership and rapid team formation. "We'd like to invite you to participate in a research project that could influence future pilot training programs. Your experience suggests some gaps in how we prepare pilots for unusual emergency scenarios." Sarah was intrigued by the research applications. If her experience could help improve training for future pilots, that would give positive meaning to what had been a traumatic situation. What would participation involve? Initially, detailed interviews about your decision-making process, your interaction with the other crew members, and your assessment of which training experiences were most valuable during the emergency. Later, we might ask you to participate in simulator exercises designed to test new training protocols. The opportunity to contribute to aviation safety research appealed to Sarah more than media interviews or speaking engagements. Research could lead to concrete improvements in how pilots were prepared for emergencies, potentially preventing future accidents. "I'm interested, Dr. Sterling. Send me the details and I'll review them." After ending the call, Sarah realized she was facing a choice about how to respond to her sudden prominence in the aviation community. She could try to return to her normal routine and let the attention fade, or she could engage with the opportunities for research, training, and safety improvement that were being offered. The decision was complicated by her own emotional processing of the emergency. Part of her wanted to move on and forget the stressful experience, but another part recognized the responsibility that came with surviving a serious aviation incident. Her phone buzzed with a text from David Park. Dinner tonight to discuss the research project idea? I have some updates from my university contacts. Sarah realized she was looking forward to David's company. His analytical approach to their experience was helping her process the emotional and professional implications of what they'd been through. Unlike the reporters who wanted dramatic quotes, David was interested in understanding the systematic aspects of their emergency response. She texted back, "Yes, let's meet at 7. And thank you for helping me think through all of this." As she prepared for another day of investigation interviews and media requests, Sarah reflected on how quickly her life had become complicated. 3 days ago, she'd been a content corporate pilot with a stable routine. Now she was at the center of an international aviation incident with opportunities and responsibilities she'd never imagined. The transformation was overwhelming, but also oddly exciting. For the first time in years, she felt like her aviation expertise could make a difference, beyond just flying wealthy passengers from city to city. Dr. Helga, Eric's daughter's call came at 7:30 a.m. on Sarah's 4th day in Iceland, and the urgency in her voice was immediately apparent. "Captain Chen, we need you at the investigation center immediately. We've discovered something that changes everything about your emergency." Sarah dressed quickly and took a taxi to the airport, her mind racing through possibilities. Had they found evidence of sabotage, a manufacturing defect, pilot error she hadn't recognized? The investigation center was buzzing with activity when she arrived. Computer screens displayed weather data, aircraft schematics, and what appeared to be a map showing multiple flight routes across the North Atlantic. "Captain Chen, thank you for coming so quickly," Dr. Eric's daughter said. "What I'm about to show you is being classified as sensitive until we can brief all relevant aviation authorities." She led Sarah to a large display screen showing the timeline of aircraft incidents over the past 6 months. Flight 447 was not an isolated event. We've identified 17 other incidents involving engine, anti-ice system failures and similar weather conditions over the North Atlantic. Most of these were managed successfully by the crews, but 3 resulted in emergency landings, and 1. She paused gravely. 1 resulted in a crash with total loss of life. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. When did that crash occur? 2 months ago. Air Europa Flight 891, Madrid to Boston. The aircraft encountered severe icing conditions similar to what you experienced. The crew lost both engines and attempted an emergency landing in Greenland, but didn't make it to the runway. The investigation screen showed photographs of wreckage scattered across a snowy landscape. Sarah recognized the aircraft type, another Boeing 777, configured almost identically to the one she'd flown. 163 people died, Dr. Eric's daughter continued quietly. The investigation is ongoing, but preliminary findings suggest engine failure due to ice ingestion, followed by loss of control during single-engine approach in severe weather. Sarah struggled to process this information. The scenario was terrifyingly similar to what they'd experienced, but with a catastrophic outcome instead of their successful emergency landing. "Why wasn't this pattern recognized earlier?" she asked. The incidents were spread across different countries and investigation agencies. Air Europa was being investigated by Spanish authorities. Other incidents were handled by American, Canadian, and British teams. No one was looking at the bigger picture until your emergency prompted us to search for similar events. Dr. Eric's daughter explained that the investigation had now become international, with teams from Boeing, the FAA, EASA, and multiple national aviation authorities working to understand what appeared to be a systematic problem. Captain Chen, your successful handling of the emergency is now critical evidence. You're the only crew that managed this specific failure mode and lived to provide detailed testimony about the aircraft's behavior and your decision-making process. The weight of this responsibility was overwhelming. Sarah realized that her experience wasn't just a personal emergency story, it was potentially crucial data for preventing future tragedies. What do you need from me? Everything. We need to understand exactly how you managed the engine failure, how you made decisions about power settings, how you coordinated with First Officer Mitchell, how you handled the passenger situation. Every detail could be the difference between other crews surviving or not. Sarah spent the next 4 hours providing the most detailed testimony of her career, describing every moment of the emergency with the precision that comes from knowing lives might depend on the accuracy of her recollections. The investigation team recorded her explanations of power management techniques, crew coordination procedures, and the decision tree she'd used when faced with multiple system failures. They were particularly interested in her choice to reduce engine power when temperatures climbed, a decision that had apparently prevented the catastrophic failure that doomed Flight 891. Captain Chen, said Dr. Sarah Martinez, a human factors specialist from the FAA, your experience suggests that current emergency procedures may be inadequate for this specific failure mode. Standard checklists tell crews to maintain normal engine operations until failure occurs, but your instinct to reduce power proactively may be the key to survival. That decision was based on engine experience more than formal training, Sarah admitted. I'd seen similar temperature patterns in smaller aircraft and knew that continuing at full power would likely lead to catastrophic failure. That's exactly what we need to understand. What training or experience gave you that insight? How can we make sure other pilots have access to the same knowledge? The interview revealed gaps in current pilot training that no one had recognized. Emergency procedures were designed for clear-cut failures, but the scenarios Sarah had faced required judgment calls that went beyond standard checklists. We need to brief airline training departments immediately, Dr. Martinez concluded. This failure mode is going to happen again, and crews need to be prepared with the insights you've provided. By afternoon, Sarah found herself in a secure video conference with aviation safety officials from 6 countries. The meeting was classified as urgent and sensitive, with strict protocols about information sharing. Captain Chen, said FAA Administrator Patricia Williams from Washington, your emergency has revealed what appears to be a significant safety issue affecting international aviation. We need your help in developing immediate safety recommendations. The scope of the problem was becoming clear. The Boeing 777 fleet included over 1,600 aircraft operated by airlines worldwide. If there was a systemic vulnerability to severe icing conditions, the potential for additional accidents was enormous. What's the timeline for addressing this issue? Sarah asked. We're issuing emergency airworthiness directives within 48 hours, replied David Chen, Director General of the Civil Aviation Administration of China. All 777 operators will receive new procedures for engine management in severe icing conditions. The new procedures would be based largely on Sarah's experience reducing engine power when anti-ice systems failed, monitoring temperature parameters more aggressively, and being prepared for rapid deterioration that could lead to catastrophic failure. Captain Chen, said Transport Canada Director Janet Morrison, we'd like you to participate in the emergency training program we're developing. Pilot instructors need to understand not just what you did, but why you made those decisions. Sarah realized she was being asked to take on a role she'd never anticipated, becoming a primary source for safety procedures that would be implemented globally. The responsibility was daunting, but she understood its importance. I'm willing to help however I can, but I want to make sure the training emphasizes team coordination. This wasn't a solo effort. First Officer Mitchell, the flight attendants, and even passengers like David Park all contributed to our success. Absolutely, agreed Dr. Elena Volkov from the Russian Federal Air Transport Agency. We're developing a comprehensive approach that includes crew resource management, passenger communication, and ground support coordination. The video conference continued for 2 hours, covering everything from aircraft modification requirements to pilot training, standards to international coordination procedures. Sarah found herself at the center of discussions that would affect aviation safety worldwide. After the conference ended, she sat alone in the investigation center, struggling to process the magnitude of what she'd learned. 3 days ago, she'd been an anonymous corporate pilot. Now she was a key figure in an international aviation safety crisis. Her phone rang with a call from Jim Mitchell. Sarah, have you heard about the other incidents? The investigation team just briefed me on the pattern they've discovered. I spent the afternoon in meetings about it. Jim, this is bigger than we realized. Our emergency was just the tip of the iceberg. I know. They want me to participate in simulator exercises to test the new procedures. Are you comfortable with that? I mean, reliving this experience repeatedly for training purposes? Sarah considered the question carefully. The thought of repeatedly simulating their emergency was emotionally challenging, but she understood its necessity. If it helps prevent other crews from going through what we experienced, or worse, then yes. We have an obligation to share what we learned. I feel the same way. It's just ... Intense to realize how many people's lives might depend on getting this right. After ending the call, Sarah stepped outside the investigation center into the cool Icelandic evening air. The northern lights were visible on the horizon, a natural display of beauty that seemed almost surreal after the day's intense discussions about aviation, safety and disaster prevention. David Park appeared beside her, apparently having had the same need for fresh air and perspective. I saw you leaving the investigation center, he said. Rough day? They've discovered that our emergency was part of a larger pattern. Other aircraft have experienced similar failures, and not all of them had our outcome. David was quiet for a moment, processing this information. That makes our experience more significant, doesn't it? Not just a story about one successful emergency, but data that could prevent future accidents. Exactly. And it's overwhelming to realize how much responsibility comes with that. They stood together watching the aurora borealis dance across the northern sky, both contemplating how their chance encounter on Flight 447 had evolved into something with global implications for aviation safety. 6 weeks after Flight 447's emergency landing, Sarah found herself standing before the International Civil Aviation Organization's Emergency Assembly in Montreal, addressing representatives from 193 countries. The ICAO headquarters buzzed with urgent activity as aviation officials worked to implement the most comprehensive safety directive in decades. Distinguished delegates, Sarah began, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. What happened aboard Flight 447 was not an isolated incident, but a warning of challenges that climate change is bringing to international aviation. The assembly hall was packed with airline executives, government officials, aircraft manufacturers, and pilot representatives. Behind Sarah, a massive screen displayed weather data showing the increasing frequency of extreme storm systems over major oceanic routes. Dr. Amanda Foster, the meteorologist who had first contacted Sarah, stood at the podium beside her. The storm system that nearly brought down Flight 447 was unprecedented in its intensity, but our models show these conditions will become increasingly common over the next decade. The presentation they delivered together represented months of Collaborative research between aviation experts and climate scientists. The data was sobering. Traditional aircraft certification standards were being exceeded by weather conditions that were becoming routine rather than exceptional. Boeing's chief engineer for the 777 program, Dr. Michael Jang, presented the manufacturer's response. We're implementing immediate modifications to anti-ice systems on all 777 aircraft. But the real solution requires fundamental changes in how we design aircraft for extreme weather operations. The modification program would ground nearly 200 aircraft for emergency retrofits, an unprecedented action that reflected the severity of the safety threat. Airlines worldwide were facing schedule disruptions and millions of dollars in costs, but the alternative was unacceptable. Captain Chen, said ICAO Secretary General Maria Santos, your decision-making during the emergency has become the foundation for new pilot training standards. How do you feel about that responsibility? Sarah had wrestled with this question for weeks. The knowledge that her split-second decisions were now being taught to pilots worldwide was both humbling and terrifying. I feel honored to contribute to aviation safety, but I want to emphasize that what happened on Flight 447 was a team effort. First Officer Mitchell's technical expertise, the flight attendant's passenger management, and even passengers like David Park's systems thinking, all of those elements were crucial to our success. The ICAO Assembly voted unanimously to implement the new safety protocols, officially designated as the Flight 447 procedures. Airlines had 90 days to retrain all pilots on the enhanced emergency protocols, and aircraft manufacturers had 6 months to complete the anti-ice system modifications, 3 months after Montreal. Sarah was back in her NetJets hangar in Columbus, Ohio, preparing for what she thought would be a return to routine corporate flights. But normalcy proved elusive when her phone rang with a call from Captain Rodriguez. Sarah, I can't thank you enough for what you did that night. His voice was strong, though she could hear the emotion beneath his professional tone. The doctors say I'm cleared to return to flying, and I wanted you to know that my first flight back will be with Oceanic. They've asked me to help implement the new training protocols. Captain Rodriguez's recovery had been remarkable, but Sarah knew the psychological impact of his cardiac emergency during the crisis had been profound. Many pilots struggled to return to flying after medical incidents, especially ones that occurred during emergencies. How are you feeling about getting back in the cockpit? She asked. Nervous, honestly. But the cardiologist says my heart is actually stronger now than before the attack, thanks to the treatment and lifestyle changes. And knowing that what happened to us is helping prevent future accidents, that gives meaning to the whole experience. Sarah understood that sentiment completely. The months Flight 447 had been a whirlwind of investigations, interviews, and training development, but knowing their experience was saving lives made the intensity worthwhile. Captain Rodriguez, I'd like to stay in touch as you develop the training programs. I think pilot perspectives from both sides of the emergency, the crew that experienced the crisis, and the instructor implementing the lessons could be valuable. I'd welcome that collaboration. Oceanic is also interested in having you consult on our emergency response procedures. Your insights into passenger communication during crises have changed how we think about cabin management. After ending the call, Sarah reflected on how her relationship with aviation had evolved. What had once been simply a career flying aircraft had become a mission to improve safety for everyone in the industry. David Park's research project had progressed beyond their initial discussions. His academic contacts had turned their emergency response into a comprehensive case study of distributed leadership during crises. The research was being applied not just in aviation, but in emergency medicine, nuclear power plant operations, and disaster response planning. Sarah, David had told her during their last video call, What we learned about improvised teams and expertise networks is revolutionizing how organizations prepare for unexpected emergencies. Flight 447 is being studied in business schools, military academies, and crisis management programs worldwide. The broader implications of their experience continued to surprise Sarah. She'd received invitations to speak at conferences on topics ranging from climate adaptation to leadership, psychology, fields she'd never imagined intersecting with her piloting career. 8 months after the emergency, Sarah was flying a routine charter flight from New York to Miami when her training in the new Flight 447 procedures proved its value in an unexpected way. At the Gulfstream G650, she was piloting encountered a severe thunderstorm over the Carolinas, not the extreme conditions they'd faced over the Atlantic, but significant enough to trigger ice accumulation warnings. Under the old procedures, she would have continued normal operations until clear system failures occurred. Instead, following the protocols developed from her Flight 447 experience, she immediately reduced power when the first signs of anti-ice system stress appeared and requested priority routing around the storm system. Executive Charter November 74 Delta Mike, we show you requesting deviation for weather. Approved as requested. Turn left heading 270. The deviation added 20 minutes to their flight time, but the ice accumulation that had been building on the engine inlets quickly dissipated once they were clear of the storm. Her passengers never knew how close they'd come to a potentially serious situation. Landing in Miami, Sarah realized this was exactly what the Flight 447 investigation team had hoped for crews, using enhanced situational awareness and proactive decision-making to prevent emergencies rather than just managing them after they occurred. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jim Mitchell. Just heard you used the new procedures on your Miami flight. How did it feel to prevent an emergency instead of managing one? Sarah smiled as she texted back, much better. Though I think I'll always be more cautious about weather than I was before. Flight 447. The psychological impact of their emergency experience had been profound for both of them. Sarah found herself studying weather reports more intensively, carrying more fuel reserves, and briefing alternative airports more thoroughly than company minimums required. The knowledge of how quickly normal flights could become life-threatening emergencies had changed her fundamental approach to risk management, but rather than making her fearful, the experience had made her more confident. She knew she could handle extreme situations because she'd proven it under the worst possible circumstances. 1 year after Flight 447, Sarah received an invitation that brought the entire experience full circle. Oceanic Airlines was dedicating their new pilot training center in Denver, and they wanted her to deliver the keynote address at the opening ceremony. The facility was state-of-the-art, featuring simulators that could recreate the exact weather conditions they'd encountered over the Atlantic. The Flight 447 emergency had become a standard training scenario, with pilots worldwide learning to manage engine failures in severe icing conditions. Standing before an audience of pilots, instructors, and aviation safety officials, Sarah looked out at faces that represented the future of commercial aviation. These were the people who would face whatever challenges climate change and technological evolution brought to their industry. A year ago, I was just another pilot deadheading home on a red-eye flight, she began. I thought the biggest challenge of that trip would be getting some sleep before my next assignment. Instead, I found myself in command of an emergency that would change not just my life, but how our entire industry prepares for extreme weather operations. She described the progression of their emergency, emphasizing the team coordination and decision-making processes that had enabled their survival. But more importantly, she talked about the lessons that extended beyond technical procedures. The most important thing we learned is that aviation safety isn't just about individual skill or aircraft. Design, it's about how people with different expertise work together under pressure. Flight 447 succeeded because a flight attendant, a private pilot, a paramedic, air traffic controllers, maintenance technicians, and emergency responders all contributed their unique knowledge to solve a complex problem. The audience included several familiar faces. Jim Mitchell was there representing the Airline Pilots Association Safety Committee. Dr. Amanda Foster had become a regular speaker at aviation conferences about weather hazards. Captain Rodriguez was developing training programs for Oceanic Airlines. And David Park was in the front row, having taken a sabbatical from his technology job to complete a PhD in crisis management, using Flight 447 as his dissertation research. After her presentation, Sarah was approached by a young pilot who looked barely old enough to drive, let alone fly commercial aircraft. Captain Chen, I'm Lisa Wang, a first officer with Regional Express. I just wanted to thank you for what you've taught us about emergency decision-making. Last month, I was flying in weather that reminded me of your Flight 447 scenario, and the training based on your experience helped me recognize potential problems before they became critical. Sarah realized this was the ultimate validation of everything they'd been through. Their emergency experience was preventing other crews from facing similar life-threatening situations. 2 years after Flight 447, Sarah stood in the cockpit of a new Boeing 777X, examining the advanced weather radar and enhanced anti-ice systems that had been developed partially in response to their emergency. The aircraft represented the next generation of aviation technology, designed to handle the extreme weather conditions that were becoming increasingly common. She was no longer flying for NetJets. The months of investigation, training development, and safety consulting had led to an offer she couldn't refuse: chief pilot for safety innovation at a major aircraft manufacturer, responsible for developing emergency procedures and training programs for new aircraft designs. Her first major project was designing pilot training for aircraft that would routinely encounter weather conditions beyond current certification standards. Climate change was requiring aviation to evolve rapidly, and her experience with extreme emergency management was crucial for that evolution. Sarah, said Dr. Alina Morrison, her research partner on the Climate Adaptation Project, the latest weather models show that Flight 447 type conditions will be routine over the North Atlantic within 10 years. Are you confident that the industry is prepared for that reality? It was a sobering question that kept Sarah awake at night. The modifications and training programs developed after Flight 447 were important steps, but they were reactive measures. The aviation industry needed to fundamentally rethink how aircraft were designed and operated for a world where extreme weather was normal rather than exceptional. I think we're making progress, Sarah replied, but we need to accelerate the pace of change. Every month we delay implementing more robust weather handling capabilities. We risk another crew facing what we went through, or worse. Her phone rang with a call from David Park, who had completed his PhD and was now consulting with airlines worldwide on crisis management systems. Sarah, I have news about the longitudinal study we've been conducting on Flight 447 passengers. The data is remarkable. David explained that his research team had been tracking all 287 passengers from Flight 447, studying how their experience during the emergency had affected their approach to risk management in their professional and personal lives. The passengers who understood what was happening and felt engaged in the emergency response showed significant improvements in leadership effectiveness and stress management in their subsequent careers. Your decision to communicate honestly with them didn't just calm them during the crisis, it actually enhanced their abilities to handle future challenges. The research implications were fascinating. Transparent communication during emergencies didn't just improve immediate safety outcomes. It could have lasting positive effects on everyone involved. 5 years after Flight 447, the aviation industry had been transformed by the lessons learned from their emergency. The enhanced weather detection systems, improved anti-ice technology, and revolutionary training programs had prevented dozens of potential accidents. Sarah received regular updates from Captain Rodriguez, who had become one of the most respected emergency training instructors in commercial aviation. Jim Mitchell had been promoted to chief pilot at his airline and was implementing advanced crew resource management programs worldwide. Dr. Amanda Foster's weather research had led to new forecasting capabilities that gave pilots much more accurate information about severe icing conditions. Her work was saving lives not just in aviation, but in other weather-dependent industries, and David Park had founded a consulting company that applied the crisis management lessons from Flight 447 to help organizations in every field prepare for unexpected emergencies. But perhaps the most meaningful update came from an unexpected source, Maria, the flight attendant who had coordinated passenger care during their emergency. "Captain Chen," she said during a phone call, "I wanted you to know that I've been promoted to supervisor of emergency training for all Oceanic Airlines flight attendants. The passenger communication protocols we developed from Flight 447 are now standard throughout the industry." Maria explained that the approach they'd used, honest communication, balanced with professional reassurance, had become the gold standard for managing passenger anxiety during emergencies. "What you taught us that night about treating passengers as partners rather than just people to control has changed how flight attendants think about our role during crises. We're not just serving drinks and checking seatbelts, we're part of the safety team." As Sarah reflected on the 5-year anniversary of their emergency, she realized that Flight 447 had become more than just an aviation incident. It had evolved into a symbol of how people could work together effectively under extreme pressure, how honest communication could build trust during crises, and how individual experiences could contribute to systemic improvements in safety. The boy who had been traveling alone in Seat 8C had grown into a young man studying aeronautical engineering, inspired by his experience during the emergency to pursue a career in aviation safety. The paramedic who had cared for Captain Rodriguez had used her aviation emergency experience to develop new training programs for medical personnel working in high-stress environments. Even the passengers who had initially panicked during the crisis had gone on to become advocates for aviation safety education, helping other travelers understand what to expect during emergencies. A decade after Flight 447, Sarah stood before the International Aviation Safety Foundation as they presented her with their highest honor, the Gold Medal for contributions to aviation safety. The ceremony was held in the same ICAO headquarters where she had first briefed world aviation leaders about their emergency. The aviation industry had been revolutionized by the lessons learned from Flight 447 and the climate adaptation challenges it had revealed. Aircraft were now designed to handle weather conditions that would have been unimaginable when she first became a pilot. Training programs emphasized the kind of distributed leadership and honest communication that had saved their lives over the North Atlantic. Most importantly, the collaborative approach to safety that had emerged from their emergency had become standard practice throughout aviation. Pilots, flight attendants, air traffic controllers, meteorologists, engineers, and passengers all understood their roles as part of an integrated safety system. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah said as she accepted the award, 10 years ago, I was just a pilot trying to get home safely. What I learned that night is that aviation safety isn't about individual heroics. It's about ordinary people doing extraordinary things together when extraordinary circumstances demand it. In the audience, she could see many of the people who had shaped her journey since Flight 447. Jim Mitchell, now an airline vice president. David Park, whose crisis management research was being applied worldwide. Dr. Amanda Foster, whose weather forecasting innovations had prevented countless emergencies, and Captain Rodriguez, who had recovered completely from his cardiac emergency and become one of the most effective safety advocates in commercial aviation. The real heroes of Flight 447, Sarah continued, were the 287 passengers who stayed calm when they were terrified, the flight attendants who maintained order in chaos, the air traffic controllers who prioritized our emergency, and the emergency responders who were ready when we reached Iceland. Aviation safety works because thousands of people are committed to getting everyone home safely every single day. As she left the stage, Sarah reflected on how her life had been changed by those few hours over the North Atlantic. What had started as a simple deadhead flight had become a career dedicated to improving aviation safety and crisis management across multiple industries. Her phone buzzed with a text from David Park. "Congratulations on the award. Want a grab dinner and discuss the next research project?" Sarah smiled as she typed her response. "Absolutely. But this time, let's meet somewhere we can drive to." The trauma of Flight 447 had never completely faded, but it had been transformed into purpose. Every day, her work contributed to preventing other crews and passengers from facing the terror they had experienced. Every new safety protocol, every improved training program, every enhanced aircraft system carried forward the lessons learned during those desperate hours when ordinary people had been forced to become extraordinary. As she walked through the Montreal airport toward her flight home, Sarah noticed the calm efficiency of the operation around her. Pilots conducting thorough pre-flight inspections, flight attendants reviewing emergency procedures, air traffic controllers monitoring weather patterns with unprecedented accuracy. The aviation industry had learned from Flight 447, and that knowledge was keeping people safe every day. That, more than any award or recognition, was the true legacy of their emergency, the quiet confidence that came from knowing their experience had made flying safer for everyone. If you've enjoyed this journey through Flight 447's incredible saga, I would be absolutely thrilled if you would hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Your support is what makes it possible for me to continue creating these novel-length stories that dive deep into human courage, technical expertise, and the incredible ways people come together during crisis. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if it kept you engaged throughout this epic adventure. And please share it with anyone you know who appreciates great storytelling, aviation, or tales of human resilience under pressure. Your comments mean the world to me. Let me know what you thought of Sarah's journey, which characters resonated with you, and what kinds of stories you'd like to see next. I read every single comment and often find inspiration for future narratives in your feedback. This is just the beginning of many incredible stories to come. Whether it's aviation adventures, medical miracles, historical mysteries, or tales of technological innovation, I'm committed to bringing you the most engaging, well-researched, and immersive storytelling possible. Until our next adventure together. Thank you for being part of this incredible community of story lovers. Subscribe, like, share, and I'll see you in the next epic tale.